Good morning, everybody. It's wonderful to be back on day 2 at the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. We have a very dynamic panel today of 2 speakers. I'm going to let them introduce themselves, and then we're going to be looking at one of the salient issues here at the Permanent Forum, where we're looking at the criminalization of Indigenous peoples and their human rights. So let me ask our guests here to introduce themselves briefly, and then we will get back to our discussion.
I'm Vicky Tauli Corpus. I am a Kankanai Igorot from the Philippines, and I am the director of Tibtiba and the past UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
My name is Fergus Mackay. I'm the Senior Legal Counsel at Indigenous Peoples Rights International.
Thank you very much. We have seen around the world Indigenous peoples confronting an increase and widespreading criminalization in the exercise of their rights, including when they protest against these very violations of their rights. And we know, we have data to show now that 36% of land defenders that are killed worldwide are Indigenous peoples. And that's really interesting because Indigenous peoples make up only 5% of the world's population. And so the threat to Indigenous land defenders is really astounding. Not to downplay the role that we have on our lands and territories. We know, and it has been globally seen, that Indigenous peoples are the protectors of nature, biodiversity, cultural heritage. But at the same time, even as they defend these territories, even as they defend their lands, we see that criminalization on Indigenous peoples is expanding, it's intensifying. Even here at forums like the UN Permanent Forum, we see a lot of issues of reprisals. Last year, we confronted some of those very issues with some of the leaders that were speaking at the Permanent Forum. We hope, of course, that our cries, our raising those issues last year, that we can see less of that case of reprisals in this year's Permanent Forum. But this is only one of the forums in which Indigenous peoples advocate and raise concerns with criminalization. And so I wanted now to highlight that this year, we heard yesterday under agenda item 4, where the Permanent Forum members presented their most recent report on criminalization. And that report, we're going to look at some of the key findings, some of the key outcomes and recommendations, and we're going to ask Fergus Mackay to help us to understand better what came out of that report. But prior to that, during your tenure as Special Rapporteur, Vicky, you dedicated a thematic report on the very same issue in 2018. And so we wanted to examine those 2 reports and see, what we can do more to really put at the fore this issue of criminalization and addressing it, addressing the violations that many of our Indigenous leaders are faced with. So maybe I give you, Vicky, the floor to speak a little bit about your findings in your report.
Thank you very much. Yes, I did a report in 2018 when I was the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And this report was done because I have been receiving consistently complaints from Indigenous peoples from all over the world about the fact that they are being criminalized. False accusations are filed against them, and several of them have been detained in the courts. And in fact, when I visited several countries to do the official visits, I did go to the prisons where some of these Indigenous leaders and activists were being kept. So it's really a very serious concern, because basically how the Indigenous peoples who have been resisting the taking over or their displacement from their lands and territories, and also from protecting their resources, they are the ones who most commonly face these charges of criminalization. They are accused as anti-development, and usually the pattern that I saw is that they are they are smeared in the social media. The social media is used very extensively by corporations and by states to smear the names of these indigenous leaders. And on that basis, they can talk to judges and prosecutors who will file cases against them. Even I personally, even while I was the UN Special Rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples, I was also included in a list of 300 so-called terrorists in the Philippines. And that was a big threat, no, to most of the people who were in that list. So this report has actually been the precursor for me to propose strongly that we create IPRI, no, the Indigenous Peoples Rights International, because I believe that focus should be given to the issue of criminalization, because this is what brings fear to indigenous communities, and it's also what curtails their capacities to assert their right to self-determination, and to be critical of states and corporations who are violating their rights. This report is, of course, supported by the data that you mentioned. About 36% of the land and environment defenders are indigenous peoples, and even if they're 5% of the population. And I'd like to end up by saying that it's not just a simple issue of individuals being criminalized, it's also communities, no, that are criminalized, and they are put to prison. My official visit to Australia showed that while Australian Aborigines are 5% of the population, they occupy 50% in the jails of Australia. And this really speaks about the kind of racism and discrimination that exists, which is the foundation for filing all these criminalization cases against them.
Thank you so much for that. I think that it's never sufficient for us to really look at the cases that exist and really contend with the realities that indigenous peoples are facing. We see the data, and we are continuing to increase this kind of data that's available to evidence these violations that are happening. And so we're very, very happy to see that the Permanent Forum as well has taken up a dedicated attention to this issue of criminalization. And as I mentioned earlier, there is now a report that they have produced, and I would like to ask Fergus to help us to understand better, first of all, what the findings were, but most importantly, what are the recommendations, and how do we ensure that those recommendations are fully and effectively implemented?
Thank you. The Permanent Forum's report very much builds upon Vicky's prior work. In fact, it states that Vicky's recommendations continue to form a strong basis for action. So it reinforces what was done already. It was done 3-4 years after the Special Rapporteur's report, so it incorporates new information. There's been a few particularly important decisions from the Inter-American Court and other places that address criminalization issues, which I'll talk about in a minute. But first, it's important to think about the definition, the understanding of criminalization that's set out in that report, because it defines it in two different ways. The first way is what most people understand, is using criminal law to hinder or stop protest, or to criminalize the activities of indigenous leaders who are speaking up for the rights of their communities, or to punish them and their communities for doing so. That's what most people understand by it. But then the bulk of criminalization is actually deeply embedded in national legal frameworks, and it's usually connected to inadequate recognition or non-recognition of indigenous people's rights in those frameworks. For instance, where national law doesn't recognize that indigenous peoples have rights to land, or only partially recognizes it, or does it in a fragmented way, or other ways that deny full ownership or full jurisdiction over those lands, areas that are not included now become available to grants to third parties, for protected areas, for climate mitigation projects, and various other things. In these areas, we're seeing that indigenous peoples are not only being denied the exercise of their rights, but they're actually being criminalized for continued occupation and use of these areas. Occupation and use that they have a right to do under international human rights law. So the root of the problem is actually national law that doesn't properly recognize Indigenous peoples' rights. And 95% of criminalization is actually located in that area, more so than using criminal law to suppress protest or to punish people for defending their rights. That's a very important point, because if you talk about criminalization only in one context, it's actually missing about 90% of the problem. So Vicky's report brings up this dichotomy as well. The Permanent Forum developed a sort of a definition that incorporates both of those. So it's drawing attention to the UN system as a whole with regard to both of those aspects. In particular, the treaty body system, the special procedures of the Human Rights Council, the UPR, and all of the agencies, programs, and funds that are involved in financing activities in different countries. And it's calling on them to pay attention to this issue in both of its aspects, either in funding or in their concluding observations or in decisions or whatever it happens to be. So it's a very important way of integrating that type of analysis throughout the UN system, which most of it is not actually doing now, or at least it isn't doing it in the way we're talking about. So there's an Office of Reprisals located at the Undersecretary General's office, but it's not very clear exactly what it does and how it does it and how it relates to a whole range of activities that take place. So there is a very definite and strong need for greater attention throughout the system on all of these particular issues. I'll highlight one very important decision from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in 2021. It was a case against Guatemala that involved the criminalization of community radio stations. And the Inter-American Court found violations not only of the right to culture, the right to freedom of expression, in conjunction with self-determination in the case of indigenous peoples. It also found that the criminalization of those activities not only violated those rights, but aggravated those violations and constituted a whole new level of violations. There was an interpretation judgment in that case where the court clarified that if you read its judgment as a whole, it required that all of those convictions be overturned, any sentences and any penalties expunged. In fact, to put it back to as if the criminalization had never occurred in the first place. That's really what should be happening with the bulk of these cases. We have people in one country in jail for up to 12 years for killing buffalo in their cultural ceremonies, which has been made illegal because it's contrary to the dominant religion's view of how to treat buffalo. Can you imagine? There are literally thousands of indigenous people in jail in that country for consuming buffalo because the dominant religion doesn't agree with it. Whereas it's part of the practice of their cultural traditions, their spiritual practice, and various other rights as well, right? So let me stop there.
Thank you, Fergus. So yes, it's very important to look at criminalization in its entire spectrum, right? There's not one way of looking at criminalization. It happens in many different forms. And, I think one of the things that is really important to highlight as well is the individual crimes and violations of human rights against indigenous individuals is not distinct and separate from the assaults and violations against entire communities, because we are part of collective communities. We are part of customary collective people. And so when you violate an individual's right, the impact is not just on that individual, it actually impacts the entire community. I also want, I would not be happy not to mention, I know I didn't introduce myself earlier, but I'm Maya Ekchi from Belize. I'm also an Indigenous rights advocate. And some years ago, in 2015, in fact, when there were trumped-up charges against myself and there were arrests, one of the things that was really important was the Office of the Special Rapporteur being able to immediately issue a warning to the government of Belize and to eventually revoke those charges, because those were false charges. And so you will see that there are many ways in which we're trying in real time and in practical ways to address these violations. The establishment of the Indigenous Peoples Rights International as an organization dedicated to this issue of criminalization is really critical. We've been building a variety variety of data on cases of violations in all the 7 geographic regions of the world, and trying to continue to highlight this very important issue, because a lot of times it does not become the core and the center of the discussions, but it is really at the center as land defenders, as human rights defenders, the ones that are protecting nature, that are protecting life. They are the ones that are under immense threat. And so I know that we're running out of time, but I wanted to have one last final question for my 2 guests here. And I just wanted to pick your brains a little. I know that there's not an answer that we have found yet to this question, but it's still a very important question that we have to continue to ask. What needs to be done? What more needs to be done in order for us to stop these violations? What more can we do? And perhaps we can sort of continue to talk about that question in the future, but it's a question that's present right now.
Well, there are lots of things that we can do, but the first thing that I think is important is the empowerment of the indigenous peoples themselves, no? The individuals as well as the communities. If they are empowered to know more about their rights and to assert and claim these rights, no? Even if they are being criminalized, the chances of them being able to get these charges dismissed are bigger, no? So that's first. And secondly, I think that resources should be made available for them so that they can avail of the services of pro bono lawyers. What I have seen in my work as the rapporteur, many indigenous leaders are in jail for a long time because there are no lawyers that will take up their case. Some of the pro bono lawyers are the most busy lawyers, and so they just visit them once in 3 months, no? And so there's really a need to make available the services of lawyers, of course, in the resources that are needed for them to be able to file the case at the domestic courts, but also to make use of the special procedures to make a report to the rapporteur. You know, it's true. When I was a rapporteur, several indigenous leaders in jail were released because I constantly wrote to the government. There were 2 in Guatemala, one from Guatemala City and one in Alta Verapaz. I visited them in jail, and I had to put pressure on the government to have them released, and they were also released. So the role that the mandate holders can play is also important. And of course, the complaints mechanisms, not just at the UN, but also at the World Bank. And since Edward is not here, he talked about the fact that the World Bank continues to fund a project in Tanzania to expand the protected areas to 10,000 square kilometers. And this has caused the displacement of indigenous peoples. And even because they complained to the World Bank, while the inspection panel is in the process of studying it, the bank already reduced, gave them gave the government $50 million to continue to expand the protected areas. And this has really caused a lot of displacement and killings of some of the indigenous peoples in those territories. No? So I think that's really something that we should constantly be aware of, the work of IPRI in terms of documenting and helping the people to document themselves, no? Because this is the first step. They are able to document, show exactly where, when, what is happening, who are the ones responsible, and sending it to the relevant bodies to get responses. And then, of course, these reports that talk about criminalization are going to be crucial also in exposing more widely the issue and getting the various multilateral bodies and countries to also speak against what's happening.
Thank you very much. Fergus, last words?
Same question? I wish I knew the answer to that. So there's a need for more jurisprudence on these issues, for sure. What Vicky says about pro bono lawyers is absolutely right. We need to be paying lawyers to do this rather than relying on their goodwill, because it's always the last on the list of cases that get attention, right? So there needs to be much greater resources going into this area through Indigenous peoples organizations and directly supporting Indigenous communities, but also to secure legal support that will prioritize their issues and their cases, right? There's a need to deep dive into national laws to identify where rights are being criminalized and where those laws need to be reformed. The Committee Against Torture under the Convention Against Torture has the ideal mechanism for doing that because one of its articles requires continuous review of national laws to deal with issues under the heading of torture and cruel and inhumane treatment. And they have explicitly defined imprisoning indigenous peoples as a form of cruel and inhumane treatment. The 50% rate in Australia is common in Canada, it's common in New Zealand, it's common in many countries around the world. It's not an Australian problem. You have the preeminent UN body on torture saying imprisoning indigenous peoples per se, let alone at those disproportionate rates, constitutes torture. So there are very clear avenues for saying we can go through national laws and address where there are criminal sanctions being unjustifiably applied to the exercise of rights, or in the context of these disproportionate and clearly discriminatory practices, racially discriminatory practices, which should be illegal constitutionally as well as under human rights law. So there was a case against Mexico recently decided by the Committee Against Torture, where they explicitly stated in their recommendations Mexico should cease the criminalization of the defense of indigenous people's rights. But it was one sentence in one case. We need more of that, and we need it more mainstreamed, and we need it attached to funding conditionalities, whether it's World Bank or whatever it happens to be. There needs to be conditions. You do not get money if you do not address this problem. And it's going to get worse. Why? 50% of transition minerals are on indigenous lands. In some countries, it's 80%, 90%. Protected areas are about to be doubled. At least the target is to double them in size. Who is going to get all of the problems from that? It's primarily going to be indigenous peoples in different parts of the world. So it's urgent that this issue is dealt with.
Thank you very much. We have run out of time, but thank you so much for providing that rich insight on both those reports and for providing the recommendations.
Thank you.